Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Education Policy Equation. I'm your host, Jack Murdoch. We're starting season 2 now of the podcast, and I guess I'm taking it in a bit of a different direction this year. I wanted to spend a lot more time focusing on the economics behind the issues we talk a lot about in the podcast. I think I really enjoy my conversations the most that are about economics, such as my conversations with Dr. Uh, Hunter, with Dr. Taylor, and with Dr. Hungerman. Um, and I think it'd be really great if we could really delve into some of the basic economic concepts behind what we've talked about in those episodes, and even things we haven't talked about in those episodes. The economics of education is a really important area of study, and it's one I'd like to spend some time talking about here. The first concept that we're going to talk about is the education production function. I think before we talk about the education production function, I'd like to talk about production functions a little bit more generally. Um, Production functions are quite simply functions of the inputs that go into the production of goods. Uh, and so, for example, one production function that's very often talked about in uh, basic economics classes is the Cobb-Douglas production function, which is the one on the screen right now, in which we've got output or the goods produced uh, on the left-hand side of the equation and capital and labor on the right-hand side of the equation. And uh, in this graph right here, each one of these curves is a level of output or production, Y1, Y2, and Y3. And uh, on the Y and X axis, respectively, we have capital and labor, which are the inputs in the Cobb-Douglas production function. And so as you can see, this is a relatively simple function with just two real variables. Uh, but I'd like to illustrate this because it kind of uh, points out the basic logic behind the education production function, which we're now going to talk about. So I wrote out here one way you can think about this. And we've got y, which is output, as a function of the inputs. Now, with the Cobb-Douglas production function, it was relatively simple to see what the output was. It was goods, and that's fairly easy to measure. So in the economics of education, output is a little bit more of a nebulous concept. Um, and some people might say it doesn't need to be measured or you shouldn't measure it. That's not a debate we're going to be engaging in this episode, although I think it's an important debate to be had. Typically, in the economic literature I've read so far on education production functions, it's generally measured in terms of standardized test scores. You might also measure it in terms of years of college, years of schooling overall. Uh, if you were to, that's very frequently how educational output is measured. The inputs into the education production function, that's another sort of complicated task to figure out what inputs you might include in this function. And so we'll go over sort of a couple broad categories of inputs that you might include. You might include school inputs. So that might be something like the teacher to pupil ratio at a school. It might be something like faculty to pupil ratio at schools, different from teacher to pupil ratio. It might be something like teacher pay, whether or not the school has a laboratory or not, how many books the school has in its library, how many administrators does the school have, how much money does the school get from the state. These are all inputs that the school might have. And the reason this is important to kind of think of these as one category is that these are sort of the categories that you can reasonably think of policy being able to influence. Policy decisions can affect how much teachers get paid. Policy decisions can affect how large the teacher pupil ratio is, at least in a public school system. Family inputs are much harder to control through policy measures, but they are also included in the education production function. So this would be things like the family's socioeconomic status, the highest level of education of the parents, the the number of books in the home that the student comes from. That's actually been looked at before, the number of books in a family's home. There are any number of variables that can tell us a little bit about what the family comes through, things like what family the student comes from, what kind of environment the student is being raised in, and it's pretty easy to see why that would have a large impact on the outcome of students. The debate sort of in the policy sphere is how much of student outcome is due to things like this and how much of it is due to things like school input. Again, one we can fairly easily, not easily, one we can control pretty directly through policy, one we can't. Ability is another thing that's often measured in the education production function, or at least attempted to measure. This is very important. Something like how 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 good the student is at doing his homework, or how high or low is the student's IQ. This is really, really difficult to measure and runs into a whole number of statistical problems that I don't think we're going to have the time to cover in this episode. We might do another episode on the econometric challenges of talking about ability in any education production function. But you could imagine finding some proxy for ability to use in your function, like a blunt instrument might be something like an IQ test, although it would be expensive to have IQ tests for all of your students or all of your in a study. That's sort of beyond the point. Um, we might do another episode and talk about it. So here's sort of a very crude example of an education production function. All this top equation really says that educational output is a function of a number of inputs coming from the school, family, and ability. So we might imagine uh, sort of running a regression analysis, something like the form of this, where the educational output, YI, that might be, let's say, SAT score for student I, um, is predicted by uh, our intercept term and uh, a constant for, um, let's say, this is uh, highest grade completed by the respondent's parents. Let's say this is uh, um, teacher pupil ratio at the school for student I. Um, and basically, we can come up with a prediction for what the educational output for student I will be. And we've got an error term here. So this is really just a simple regression analysis for educational output. And obviously this is pretty crude, but it gives you a good idea of what the education production function is sort of trying to do. And I think uh, I'll point out where we sort of get caught up in debates, as I alluded to earlier. Uh, there's debate over whether school inputs matter at all. I mean, there's an argument that's frequently made, which is that family inputs are the only thing that matters. I mean, you are largely determined by how you are raised, the genes you're given, any number of things. And some people say, I mean, your family's socioeconomic status. We know very unfortunately that children from lower socioeconomic statuses tend to do worse in school. So the argument might be, well, they're given a really bum deal because their family inputs are all wrong and there's nothing school inputs can do about that. This was sort of the conclusion that James Coleman, the sociologist, came to in his 1968 report that's now known as the Coleman Report. He pretty much said it's really only family that matters. Schools can't do that much to help kids. Eric Hanushek and others have countered that no, schools do matter. However, it's important to look at how we measure schools and what variables within this broader category of school inputs are important. So uh, that's that's um, that's sort of an important debate that's going on right now, and one which uh, the education production function, at least theoretically, should help us uh, to solve. Um, so I think I'm going to end it there. Um, I feel as I'm finishing this video how little I've really gone into talking about all this. there's a lot more complexity to this issue in terms of just the econometric challenges faced. There's a lot more to cover. Um, I don't know if my next video will be about the education production function, um, or if I'll move on to something else, but at least at some point in the future, I think it would be helpful to return to this idea and maybe flesh it out a bit more thoroughly. But for that, I'm going to sign off. I want to thank you all for tuning in today to the Education Policy Equation. Thank you.